There is a moment in every science story where the facts stop making sense in the best possible way, where you read a sentence twice, then a third time, and it still sounds like something someone made up. This is one of those stories. In early 2025, 4 wolf pups were born in a facility in Texas. Their names are Nneka, Ash, Blaze, and Cinder. On the surface, that sounds routine. Wolf pups are born. It happens. But these 4 animals carry something inside them that by every rule of conservation biology should not exist anymore. They carry the genetics of a bloodline that the scientific world had quietly accepted as lost, not endangered, not declining, but gone, erased, a closed chapter. What brought them back was not some dramatic, laboratory miracle pulled from science fiction. It was something stranger and, in its own way, more beautiful than that. It was a mistake, a decades-old biological accident that nobody planned, nobody predicted, and that for years everyone assumed was making things worse. Understanding how 4 living wolves got built from DNA the world had written off means going back a very long way. It means going back to the moment this animal began to disappear. The red wolf was once one of the defining predators of the American Southeast. Its range stretched from the Gulf Coast of Texas all the way to the Atlantic seaboard, covering an enormous sweep of swamp, forest, and wetland. It was not a rare animal. In 1939, a wildlife biologist named Stanley Young noted that red wolves were still common across eastern Texas. Common. That word matters. In a single year, more than 800 of them were trapped in just one region of one state. Young concluded from those numbers that the red wolf was essentially indestructible. Too clever, too well hidden, too comfortable in the dense thickets and marshes where people rarely ventured. He wrote them off as untouchable. He was catastrophically wrong. Within 4 decades of that confident assessment, the red wolf would be declared extinct in the wild. What happened in between was not natural. It was policy. For generations across the American South, killing predators was treated as an act of civic responsibility. Government programs with real budgets and real crews were deployed specifically to eliminate anything with fangs from a landscape. Wolves, coyotes, foxes, all of them targets. The red wolf had the particular misfortune of being exactly the right size to be caught in that machine. Too wolf-like to be tolerated, too regionally limited to escape. Bounty by bounty, the range collapsed. By 1970, the last wild red wolves in North America were clinging to a narrow strip of coastal marsh along the border between Texas and Louisiana. That thin band of soggy wetland was the final remnant of an animal that had once ruled half a continent, from common to functionally extinct in a single human lifetime. Facing that collapse, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made one of the most desperate decisions in American conservation history. They decided to remove the red wolf from the wild entirely. Every animal they could physically capture would be pulled from the marshes and placed in captivity before the last wild individuals disappeared for good. The logic was brutal and simple. Better wolf behind a fence than no wolf at all. Trappers fanned out across the Gulf Coast wetlands, and over 6 years hauled in more than 400 wolf-like animals from Texas and Louisiana. 400 animals. That sounds like enough raw material to save a species. Then came the genetic testing to determine which of those animals were actually red wolves, and which were coyotes, hybrids, or something in between. The number collapsed. Out of more than 400 animals captured, only 17 were confirmed as genetically pure red wolves. And of those 17, only 14 successfully bred in captivity. 14 individual animals. Every red wolf alive on Earth today traces its ancestry back to those 14 founders. Not hundreds, not dozens, 14. And even 14 flatters the situation. Geneticists later calculated that those founders were so closely related to each other that they effectively carried the genetic diversity of only about 8 individuals. This is what biologists call a genetic bottleneck, and it is one of the most insidious threats a species can face. Genetic variation, the biological raw material that allows a population to fight off disease, adapt to changing conditions, produce healthy offspring, gets compressed into almost nothing in a single generation. What survives is narrow, fragile, and prone to repeating the same inherited weaknesses across every animal born from that point forward. The red wolf had been saved from extinction and simultaneously dropped into a genetic dead end. The rescue and the trap were the same act, and nearly every inbreeding problem the species would face for the next 50 years was baked into that foundation right there, somewhere around 1980. The captive breeding program that followed was painstaking work. Anchored primarily at the Point Defiance Zoo in Washington state, biologists spent decades carefully pairing animals to squeeze out every last drop of variation those 14 founders could offer. For most of that history, only about a quarter of all breeding attempts produced pups that survived to adulthood. The toll of inbreeding showed up exactly as geneticists had feared: weaker immune systems, smaller litters, stalled fertility. After decades of meticulous management, that survival rate was pushed up to roughly 45%. Decades of effort to move one number from a quarter to just under half. In 1987, the program attempted something with no precedent anywhere on Earth. Biologists took captive-bred red wolves and released them into the wild at the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in eastern North Carolina. It was the first time in recorded history that a large apex predator had been reintroduced to the wild after being fully wiped out of it. There was no playbook. Nobody knew whether animals raised behind fences could relearn how to be wolves. It worked. The wolves hunted. They denayed. They raised their own pups. By 2012, roughly 120 wild red wolves were living and breeding in the swamps and pine forests of coastal North Carolina. A species declared extinct in the wild was winning. Then came the decade that almost ended everything. Funding dried up. Leadership within the recovery program wavered and changed. Wolves were hit by cars on rural roads cutting through their territory. Many were shot, sometimes genuinely mistaken for coyotes, sometimes killed deliberately by people who simply did not want them there. The agency responsible for protecting them largely stopped enforcing its own rules and slowed new releases to almost nothing. The safety net that had taken 25 years to build quietly unraveled. From 120 wolves in 2012, the wild population dropped to roughly 40 by 2018, then down to about 14. By 2020, there were as few as 7 red wolves left in the entire wild. 7. And with so few mates available, the scattered survivors began doing the one thing biologists had spent decades desperately trying to prevent. They began pairing with coyotes. For conservationists, that interbreeding had always represented the final threat. Every time a red wolf paired with a coyote, a little more of the distinct red wolf bloodline dissolved into something that was no longer quite wolf and not quite coyote. A slow genetic blurring that could erase a species without killing a single animal. The body lives on. The genes keep passing. But the specific, distinct thing you were trying to protect quietly disappears into the average. What nobody knew, what nobody even suspected, was that this supposed catastrophe had been quietly saving the species for 40 years. Ron Wooten was a wildlife biologist living on Galveston Island off the Texas coast. For years, something about the local coyotes had been bothering him. They were too large, too broad in the skull, too long in the leg, too wolf-like to be ordinary coyotes. He was not chasing a grand theory. He was just a biologist who kept running into the same wrong-looking animal and could not let it go. In 2013, he photographed one of these animals sleeping on an airport runway. He sent tissue samples to a geneticist at Princeton named Bridget Von Holt, who sat down with her colleague Kristen Brzezinski and ran the sequencing. What they found should not have been possible. The Galveston coyotes were carrying long, unbroken stretches of red wolf DNA. Not a faint trace. Not a statistical whisper. In some animals, red wolf ancestry made up more than a third of the entire genome. And then came a part that genuinely stopped them cold. Some of that red wolf DNA did not match anything in the captive population. It was wolf code that had never been recorded, never been banked, never made it into those 14 founders. Lost genetics. Material the official red wolf bloodline no longer carried, and had not carried for generations. They called it ghost alleles. Genetic ghosts of red wolves long dead, still walking around alive inside their coyote descendants. The most concentrated deposits turned up in the isolated wetlands of Cameron Parish, Louisiana, on protected land where coyote hunting was not permitted. In some areas, nearly 2/3 of the local coyotes carried red wolf DNA. A few animals tested as high as 69% wolf ancestry. One sample reportedly came back at 100%. The interbreeding that everyone had been fighting to prevent had, entirely by accident, backed up the red wolf genome. It had smuggled red wolf genetics forward through the decades, generation after generation, riding quietly inside coyotes, animals nobody was trapping, nobody was poisoning, nobody was trying to erase. For 40 years, conservationists had been guarding the last red wolves behind fences, while a far larger reservoir of the species had been quietly multiplying in the Gulf Coast marshes, unguarded, uncounted, and completely unknown. This is where a Dallas-based biotechnology company called Colossal Biosciences enters the story. Working alongside the ghost wolf researchers, Colossal set out to do something that was simple to describe and extraordinarily difficult to execute. They would take the animals carrying the highest red wolf ancestry, those living, breathing vaults of ghost DNA out in the marshes, and clone them. Pull that lost genetics back into the real red wolf population and use it to break open the genetic dead and those 14 founders had created. The method they used was notable in its own right. Traditional cloning typically demands invasive tissue extraction and surgery, a difficult and risky process with wild animals. Colossal's team worked instead with endothelial progenitor cells, which can be drawn from a simple blood sample. A single vial of blood from a wild ghost wolf drawn in the field became the source material for a living cloned animal. No surgery, no hours of sedation, just blood, and a technique that, if it proves replicable at scale, could fundamentally change how the world approaches the rescue of endangered species. In early 2025, 4 wolf pups were born. NECA, Ash, Blaze, and Cinder. Each carries between 69 and 72% red wolf ancestry, the highest ghost lineage ever recovered from any living animal anywhere. And, as something of a side effect, the project produced the first complete red wolf referenced genome ever assembled. A full gene-for-gene map of the species, something that, astonishingly, had never existed before despite half a century of frantic conservation effort. Even if every living red wolf vanished tomorrow, the blueprint of what the species is would no longer be lost with them. While all of this was unfolding in Texas laboratories, something was also shifting in